All the way from Bokota village in Limpopo, South Africa, we bring you Missionary Minds, where you can learn about family, church history, biblical worldview issues, and of course, missions, all from the mind of a real-world missionary of almost 20 years. And Buddy Paul, today we want to discuss navigating the practical implications of the one flesh union in marriage. We've discussed this before, but we want to dive into a bit of depth. How are people still able to maintain individual persons, but at the same time be one flesh? And we're hoping you can help take that apart for us. Do you mind kicking it off? Over to you, Mfundisi.
First, a story. The wife of the great preacher Charles Spurgeon, named Susanna Spurgeon, has a section in the autobiography of Spurgeon where she gives an anecdote about a couple that was climbing through the snowy mountains and glaciers in the Alps. And as they were walking around, there was an accident, terrible accident, and the husband fell and down into a ravine. And given the nature of the mountains, not only did he die, but they could never retrieve the body. And many years passed and decades passed. And now 40 years later, because of some kind of glacier movement, they actually recovered the body. But the body had been essentially entombed in this block of ice, essentially. So here's the woman now. It's 40 years later, and she's an old woman, but it's as though the husband had never aged. And the old woman was looking back, and for a moment, it took her back to the husband of her youth, a man that she had enjoyed so much love and intimacy with. And Susanna Spurgeon used that illustration as she actually penned one of the chapters. Obviously, it's an autobiography that Spurgeon wrote, but she wrote some of it because it was actually published after the death of her husband in his late 50s. And she said, as I'm looking back at our marriage together, and as I look through his diary and his journal, and as I penned these lines, and as I compose this book, it's as though I'm looking back at the husband of my youth. It's as though I'm looking at that block of ice, and here I am, an older woman now, and I've seen, I'm going to talk about the 19-year-old boy wonder preacher and those days in London. That kind of intimacy, that kind of love stemmed from the third prong that we're going to talk about, the third prong of marriage in Genesis 2:24, and that is the one flesh union. It is the deepest kind of relationship that humans can have here on earth. That is that one flesh sexual union. And we're going to try to unpack that today, talking about, first of all, what that actually means, and then second, what it doesn't mean, and how there can still remain individuality even in the midst of this intense emotional and physical union.
Thank you, brother. That was a good story to just kick it off for us. What's the scripture actually for those who haven't heard of this before? Where does it come from?
Genesis 2:24, quoted in the New Testament many times by Jesus, but it is the best definition of marriage in the Bible. It goes like this: therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So we would define marriage with three prongs, as though the stool of marriage has three legs. The first leg, or the first part of marriage, we would say it's commenced by consent. So that is the idea of the man leaving his father and his mother. There's not coercion, there's not force. He's not dragging the woman to his house. Actually, she's consenting, he's consenting. He's leaving his father and his mother, and he's going to his wife. So that's the first step. Second step would be it's concluded by commitment. You can see that in the verse, he cleaves to his wife. It's the kind of deepest commitment. And we see this most often in weddings with a vow or an oath where they are committing to each other. So it's commenced by consent. It's continued by commitment. And then the final part, which we're talking about today, and they shall become one flesh. We would say it is concluded, at least the forming of the marriage, it's concluded by consummation, sexual consummation. So that word consummation has a lot in it. It comes from two words, con, with, and then summa, which means the highest. It means supreme. And really, marriage is the highest, and it is the most supreme relationship, a human relationship that you can have on earth. And it is really the capstone of that one flesh sexual union, which we would call consummation. And it is not just a physical part, although the physical part is that, but you think about the vulnerability, you think about all that comes along with that physical one flesh union. It's so intense, it's so intimate, it's so high, it's the highest, it's the loftiest, that it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus said, actually, the only grounds, or one of the only grounds that can actually end a marriage would be porneia, or it would be sexual immorality because of the intensity of that union.
Thank you, brother. It sounds like from what you're sharing here, and as you've rightly said, that consummation is the pinnacle, the capstone, that would lead many to believe that the one flesh union is linked only to intimacy. Does it go beyond that in the way that a married couple lives and a husband and wife live with one another?
I think that's what it's primarily talking about, is the sexual union. Although it goes beyond that, as we talked about. You could even say all three of those parts go beyond the actual. A man leaves his father and his mother. He cleaves to his wife. I think the cleaving to the wife is more of the commitment side, and then the emotional side, where he's dedicating himself to his wife, and then they become one flesh. And I think that's talking about the sexual union. But even when we say that it's one flesh, it's not like concrete, where you take your sand and you take your cement and you take the stone and you mix it all together. You take all these different parts, you mix them together, and then it's indistinguishable. Like, you can't separate the water from the sand from the stone. That's not the way it is with marriage. You still have individuals. You still have Adam. You still have Eve. You still have Paul. You still have Melinda. They still have a sense of their individuality, even though that one flesh union brings them together as one flesh, so to speak.
So let's dive into that a bit. I can imagine, and I don't even have to imagine, I know that a lot of marriage has to do with decision making. You're constantly making decisions and having to go back and forth. What does the one flesh union look like with regards to decision making? Are all decisions going to be agreed upon? Are they going to be the same? Is it only one party?
We know from Ephesians 5 that the man is the leader of the home. She is to submit to him. That's hupotasomenoi, which simply means she places herself under the authority of her husband. I think a healthy marriage is that they make joint decisions. Although the husband is at the helm, he's steering the ship. He has the executive decision, makes the final call. He leads them where they're going to go, but very rarely in my own marriage would I just make a decision where my wife is like opposed to it. I know the Lord's blessed her with much wisdom. We make joint decisions. My children are even here now, and they could vouch for me that it happens over and over and over again where I say, Melinda, can I meet you in the back room? That's where our bedroom is. So I just say, can I meet you in the back room? And that means a couple things. One is, we don't want to have the game plan necessarily in front of all the players. All right. We want to have our own little huddle where we can talk about things privately because there might be some disagreement, and we don't want that disagreement to be public. And then second of all, it communicates, I have a decision to make. I want to know your thoughts. It might be discipline with the kids. It might be where I'm going to be going that day. It might be a business decision. We're constantly bouncing these things off each other. Although it's rarely like, what should I do? It's, I think we should go this direction. Almost always my wife will say, this sounds great, or she'll say, have you thought about this? Or she'll push back a little bit. So they're joint decisions. And yet there are other times when I'm not around and I trust her to make decisions in my stead. And isn't that what Proverbs 31 says when it describes the virtuous woman? It says her husband trusts in her.
Yeah.
But that trust is very much earned. If you read through that, and in fact, even the very next line, it says something like, she does him good and not evil all her days. So the reason he trusts in her is because she's earned it. She has done him good for so many years or for so much time that he trusts her. So there's a sense of that belief in one another, making a joint decision, although the marriage is not 50-50 in the sense of it's the democracy. Like she gets 50% of the vote, he gets 50%. It's like he's the leader of the home. He makes the final decisions. But I think those should be made together.
That's very helpful. And for a man who maybe is new to the faith or is just not as educated as his wife and feels like she always comes up with good decisions or good options, should he always be defaulting to her? Is there anything wrong with that?
In that situation, I can imagine that happening a lot. I think what he shouldn't do is be self-conscious now. And even when she makes a good decision or she recommends, like, we should get this car. He says that we should get car A. She says car B. He does the research and realizes she's definitely right on car B. But I can't allow her. So let's go with car A. Like, don't do that. What he needs to do is go with car B when he sees that it's the right decision. But then what he needs to do is raise his game. So that he is informed and he is leading in the right direction so that she will trust him just as he trusts her, like the virtuous woman. She needs to trust him by having a track record of good decisions. Let's give a biblical example. Remember the story of the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings, I believe it is, where promised the son, and then the boy is out working with the father and he has heat stroke and he essentially dies. And the mother, who was just like, this was her precious only child, and she sees him and she realizes this is a big problem. Now, what does she do? She, in that moment, basically tells her husband what to do. She's like, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And the husband even comes back and he says, well, are you sure? Are you sure you want to do that? And she says, just do it. Okay, now, that's a great story. I love that story because she made the right decision. She made the right call. And the husband realized, in one sense, like, this was her territory, this was her domain. She made the right call. She says, somewhat unusual, generally he's the one making the decision, was this call. She says, do this. And he says, I'll do it. And I think you can kind of say, like, let's get car B. And he realizes, you know what? I was going with this lemon over here. I thought this was a great idea. And I'm realizing that would be a really bad decision. Men, don't be self-conscious and say, like, well, I've got to be on top. I can't show. If she's right, say, good call. Absolutely. Let's go with car B. He did that. He said, let's go with car B. And ultimately, it was so much better, not because of a car, but the son came back to life because she made the right decision. So men, be careful about it. Raise your game so that you're known in the home of making really great decisions. Don't complain. Well, my wife doesn't listen to me. Well, that's because you keep on making bad decisions. You use your money poorly. You waste it on video games. You're using it in better bets. You're using your time foolishly. You bought the four-wheeler that's not running anymore. You're doing all kinds of, and what is she supposed to do? Of course she doesn't trust you because you made bad decisions. Make an effort of making as many sound decisions as possible. And then she's going to, not only will she be willing to follow your lead, she wants to, God has made women to want to help. They have been made and created for the man. Remember, we've said again and again, God made the man to tend the garden, and God made the woman to tend the man. She's created that way. Now, feminism will try to push her against her bent, and sin will push her against that and say, no, you need to be the leader. She's naturally inclined to do that. I read The Transformed Wife, perhaps you've heard of, on X Twitter. And she's an older woman that gives outstanding counsel to women on marriage issues. And she said, I've been in something like 85 countries. And she said, I can tell you, women don't want to work outside the home. And she said, I know what everyone's saying. No. She said, I'm telling you, every country, every place, they might say it on the outside, but when you get down to it, if it's a godly situation, they don't want to work outside the home. They want to be nurturers because that is their nature. Men, don't throw that away. Use that, make right decisions together so that even though you're in a sense making it together, she knows he's leading her home.
Yeah. That's very good, brother. And just thinking of the women who are listening to this, because here on Missionary Minds, we're all about male headship and leadership and taking the charge. But some people are, like the women are listening and they have to follow the lead, but their husbands aren't listening to the podcast. And if that's you, recommend for him to listen to it.
Yes.
But they don't know what to do with a husband who's always making bad decisions. Is there any sort of course of action or recourse for a woman who's in that situation and trying to find out how to go forward?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, let's use family worship, for example. Let's say the man is insecure. He hasn't been leading family worship. She's the more godly of the two, which is very common in marriages today. The woman is the spiritual leader. She's more spiritually mature. She reads her Bible more. She knows the scriptures more. She makes better decisions. Let's say he's a Christian, kind of a nominal Christian. He's not leading the family. I would even say in a situation like that, one thing the woman could do is she could conclude, okay, he's not going to be Charles Spurgeon every morning leading our family in worship. But I could say, as the woman, she could say, would you be willing to just read this passage for us? And okay, I could do that. Like, I'm not going to be able to preach a sermon, but I can do that. So what is she doing? Like, behind the scenes, she's not trying to show him up. She's kind of directing it and saying, I want you to lead. If you stand up before the family and you just read Matthew 1, I think that would be a great start. Men have egos. They don't want to be ridiculed, especially in public. So do that kind of behind the scene, help him make the right decisions, even if you kind of, there's been times where my wife has, like, it looked in the end like I did something great, but like behind the scenes, it's like, it's like I drove the car outside the garage, but like she was behind the scenes, like, putting the lug nuts on the wheels and everything. But she was doing that because she wants me to succeed. Now, that doesn't happen most of the time because I'm the leader in the home, but I think that's one like practical way.
Yeah.
Now, let me go to the flip side, because there are going to be examples where the wife is kind of the leader and the man's the deadbeat. But I think there's also cases where the man is so much of an initiator and so much of a leader, and you've got the women that are just kind of sitting back and saying, I just want to submit and I'm just going to sit at home. And I would say that could go to the other extreme. When we're to be, when women are to be managing the home, it doesn't mean that they're to be lazy, and it doesn't mean that they don't show initiative. You read Proverbs 31, and I prefer calling it the industrious woman, not the virtuous woman, because she is so proactive. She's the one who's giving the food to her maidens, and she's the one who goes and gets her food from afar. It's like she's the one who sees the field and buys it. Like she's the one she's making out the grocery list. She's paying the bills, even though the bacon came from the husband. She's the one who's making the payments. I even think in my own home, I think if anyone saw us, I'd say Paul is a very proactive leader, but she is doing so much of the business behind the scenes. And I think very much so, that's the example of Proverbs 31. So let's make sure that we're not falling off the horse on one side or the other. On the one side, it can be the deadbeat dad who's not doing anything. On the other side, it can be the deadbeat woman who's just sitting around saying, I'm supposed to submit. He does everything. I'll kind of do a few things around the house. No, she ought to be rolling up her sleeves and actively working to make the house profitable.
That's very helpful, brother. And It's just showing once again what you were saying earlier, that the woman is to tend to the man. So even in his leadership, she's helping him to make better decisions and to become a better man. If we just move forward a bit, some practical examples. What does the one flesh union look like with children? So if we're thinking homeschooling and a wife prefers one curriculum over another, or a husband prefers firmer discipline than the wife does, how do people reach one flesh decision making in that situation?
Know each other's strengths. I tell my wife again and again, when it comes to discipline, men command more authority. They have a deeper voice. They have a greater presence. They're stronger, more muscular. They've got a beard. They've got muscles. God has created all of that to communicate authority. So I tell my wife again and again, when it comes to schooling, I will not be able to be there for every moment of discipline. But if there's, a considerable problem, constantly bring them to me, whether I'm at the home at the time and I can do it, or at the end of the day, she needs to know I have her back. I'm never going to, sell her out and take the kid's side. If I do see something where I think the kids might be right in this situation over mama, then I'm definitely that's going to be a private powwow so that they can see that we're always united. And then there's a lot of cases where, again, Proverbs 31, her husband safely trusts in her. There are so many aspects when it comes to homeschooling, like curriculum. That's just like, go for it, milady.
Yes.
Just run with it. I trust you. Oh, but what do you think? Personally, I don't think the curriculum makes that big of a difference. The point is they need to be learning well and giving them the tools of knowing how to study. But in the end, do your best. Holidays, or how we should use our days off, or how we should use money, or particular issues with the children. I just had a recent issue where we had a discipline with one of our children. It was a joint effort. We sat down together. We made sure that it was private so that there was no other children around to embarrass them. But I think it's very important, especially with the children, always present a unified front. Don't argue publicly. Don't even disagree. And we've not always followed this rule, but don't even disagree publicly. If there's disagreement, privately figure it out and then present a united front.
That's very helpful. And I'm just thinking of what you're describing with homeschooling. With my son just freshly arrived in the home, and it's been an exciting time, but it's also felt like I'm a bit of a passenger because my wife is way more involved and knows a lot more. She's had training from before, and she's going through Baby Wise and learning from other women so quickly. Just the day-to-day administrative logistics of taking care of another human being, she excels at. And I'm constantly thinking in my mind that this is a way an area in which she's gifted and more knowledgeable. And so I trust a lot of what she's doing. Another important reason for marrying, right? But I trust a lot of what she's doing. And it makes me think of as well how men can be like bulldozers, where a woman can be like a bicycle. Men, they pick one thing, they grind at it, they get it done. And a woman can turn in a more agile manner and get to many different things. But a man's trying to get specific things done. And yeah,
the aircraft carrier versus the jet ski, right?
Exactly.
I would give another example of, in our home, my wife is just incredibly gifted with business, which I am not. So that would be a case where in the home I grew up in, my father generally did the business and my mother was not very gifted in that. And I would say probably in most homes, it would be the man who would take care of all the numbers. I take care of the big purchases, the house, the cars, the research, those items. I take care of the mapping out the holidays and furloughs. But as far as like the finer details of bills, and like my wife does all of that. So I would encourage couples, if you have a particular gift, don't think that it necessarily has to fit into a particular mold. Now, there are some non-negotiables. The man is always the leader of the home. That's his role. The woman is always to be the helper of the home. That's her role. But there's going to be differences in skills. And don't be afraid to follow those skills, just as long as you follow the broader rules that Scripture lays out.
What a treat, Mfundisi. To our audience, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to rate it and subscribe to keep posted with more upcoming content. Feel free to share this episode with someone who might find it interesting and submit any questions you may want answered in a future podcast. You can email those questions to paulschleiline@gmail.com. You can also visit betweentwocultures.com for other resources like this. I'm your host, Yamikani Katunga, and until next time, that's it from Missionary Minds.